afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. I'm going to introduce the moderator for our next panel, and that will be my colleague in English, UCI Endowed Chair of Rhetoric, and Virginia Jackson. And she is, as I'm sure you already know, the author of Dickinson's Misery, A Theory of Lyric Reading, of the edited volume Periodization and Its Discontents, and co-editor with Jopi Prinz of The Lyric Theory Reader, and we're anxiously waiting her next book on Before Modernism to go back to this theme that has emerged several times in this conference, and kind of genealogical anxiety, I might call it. Anyway, she runs a terrific series here, which I thank her for, on Poetics, Rhetoric, and History, and we'll now turn the floor over to Jenny and our panelists, who should actually be sitting up front.
Actually, they were there because of the PowerPoints.
Got it. All right. Now I have an explanation, and I will stop trying to mastermind everything. Okay.
So I don't know if you heard, but we'll sit in front afterward. But for now, we're going to, the table's empty only because there are going to be PowerPoints rather than people to look at. And then there will be people to look at after the PowerPoints. The question that the participants for this panel were assigned was, and you can of course read this in your program, over the past 40 years, many performing artists, visual artists, and writers claim to have learned from reading critical theory and engaging with its concepts. During this time period, what, if anything, have critical theorists learned from the arts? How might renewed or intensified scrutiny of artistic practices constructively inflect emerging and future iterations of critical theory? That's a hard question. That seems like a really hard question to me. That these panelists, right, yeah, yes, inherited. I will say that I'm moderating this panel. I'm honored to moderate this panel. I didn't have anything to do with making up that question. And I just went, and if I had, I would have asked it slightly differently. What is the art of critical theory? After all, everyone here has serious chops. I've been thinking about Matthew Arnold, of all people, lately. A century and a half ago, he wrote that, and this is, of course, Arnold, "To have the sense of creative activity is the great happiness and the great proof of being alive. And it is not denied to criticism to have it. But then criticism must be sincere, simple, flexible, ardent, ever widening in its knowledge." You know, Arnold had to have that little litotes that was, you know, it's not denied, well, whatever. But it means it can have it. I'd say that the reason that art schools are kept alive by critical theory, the reason that Poetics and the new novel are shot through with critical theory, is that theory, or I suppose we could just say thinking, is itself a creative activity. Lauren Berlant was supposed to be on this panel but couldn't make it. So that allows me to point to her work in her absence as exemplary of the way in which criticism is, or at least can be, a creative activity, especially as it adjusts and queers and racially and, yes, historically calibrates the way we think now to possible forms of shared world-making. We don't need to keep idealizing the same small canon of artworks and the same small canon of theory. All of the panelists actually present respond to that challenge in different ways, and it is my pleasure to introduce them. I will conserve their time by keeping the introductions short. You know who they are. In any case, you know how to do the Google. Jacques Lezra is professor of Spanish, English, and comparative literature at New York University. His most recent book is Wild Materialism, The Ethic of Terror and the Modern Republic, a book on Cervantes, Contra los fueros de la muerte, el suceso cervantino, how did I do, Jacques? Okay, yeah, is forthcoming in Spanish from Polifermo. A book entitled On the Nature of Marxist Things is in preparation. Lezra was has published a whole bunch of other stuff, and with Emily Apter and Michael Wood, is the co-editor of the translation into English of the Vocabulaire Européen de Philosophie. With Paul North, he edits the Northwestern University Press book series, Idiom. That was his condensed bio. David Palumbo-Liu is the Louise Hewlett Nixon Professor at Stanford University and Professor of Comparative Literature and English. His fields of interest include social and cultural criticism, human rights and social justice, literary theory and criticism, and studies in race and ethnicity. His most recent book, The Deliverance of Others, Reading Literature in a Global Age, is his most recent book, and he is also co-editor with Bruce Robbins and Nirvana Tanuki of Emmanuel Wallerstein and The Problem of the World, Scale, Culture, System. Palumbo-Liu is contributing editor to a lot of different publications you all read, including Al Jazeera and the LARB. Avery Slater is a postdoctoral fellow in the English department at the University of Texas at Austin, where her teaching focuses on the topics of ecology, technology, and the concept of modernity and world literature. She also holds an MPhil from the University of Cambridge in critical theory with an emphasis in the history and philosophy of science. Her work in comparative modernist poetics, technology studies, and film theory has recently appeared in or is forthcoming from Cultural Critique, American Literature, Thinking Verse, and the Theory of the Millennium, a volume she is co-editing with Mark Redfield. Currently completing her book manuscript on late modernist poetics and technology, she is also beginning work on her second project on eco-poetics, translation theory, and the question of non-human language. Stephen Barker is interim dean of the UCI Claire Trevor School of the Arts and professor of drama. He has acted, directed, danced, choreographed, and taught professionally in New York, London, and of course throughout Europe and South and Central America. He's published widely on philosophy and on literary and aesthetic theory. His books include Autoaesthetics, Strategies of the Self After Nietzsche, Excavations in Their Objects, Freud and the Collecting of Antiquities, Signs of Change, Postmodern Modern, Body Theory, and Interrogating Images, which is forthcoming. I welcome all of the panelists and look forward to a lively discussion. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, George, Gabi, Julia, for inviting me, and thank you to the staff for pulling this all off. It's been a really wonderful series of events. And now for something completely different. Radha mentioned James Dean, so I had to throw in a movie. I'm going to try to do 3 things in about 5 minutes. I think I can pull it off. 4 key words and a story that will unpack this image. So that's the sort of enticement for you to allow me a few minutes, maybe after 5 minutes, in a kind of Scheherazade way. The 4 key words are transgression, performance, plasticity, and activism. Part 1. In May 1989, Edward Said delivered the Wellick Library Lectures here at UCI. Mark Poster had invited him to speak and suggested that Said give his talks on the subject of music. He did, and the lectures were then collected in a book entitled Musical Elaborations. There are many things you can pull out of the lectures, of course, but I just want to pull out this idea of transgression and performance, not performativity, but performance. First, in terms of transgression, in his lectures, Said marks his difference from Adorno, who, quote, presumes an inescapable historical trajectory that incorporates everything in its relentless forward path. Said suggests, quote, an alternative based on a geographical or spatial idea that is truer to the diversity and spread of human activity. For him, classical music, quote, participates in the differentiation of social space. It has the faculty to travel, to cross over, drift from one place in society to another, even though many institutions and orthodoxies seek to confine it. These transgressive instances occur precisely as music is performed. Here is Said on performance. Because concert music unfolds in a highly rarefied temporal duration, Performance is therefore of greater immediate import, more urgent, more stressed, more inflected for music than it is for reception in either literature or painting. Concert occasion itself is the result of a complex historical and social process, specialized eccentric skills, a performer's interpretive and histrionic personality fenced in by his or her obligatory muteness. For Said, a musical performance is an absolutely unique and irrepeatable event, what he calls, quote, an extreme occasion. Unlike viewing a painting or reading a book, where you can revisit a museum or a library or an archive and find the same thing there. He makes that statement. I want to tie this notion of performance into the idea of interruption in Catherine Malabou's work, and most fittingly, perhaps, in the idea of eruptive, interruptive explosivity and plasticity. So now on to part two. As was mentioned in my introduction, I blog a lot, and the first thing that you learn when you blog is never to read the comments. But sometimes you get wonderful emails, and the most wonderful one I ever got was from Catherine Malabou 3 years ago for a blog I did in Truth Out called Poetry, Plasticity, and Philosophical Activism. And I'll unpack that last term because it belongs to somebody else. Catherine Malabou provides a specific answer to the question posed in the title of her book, What Should We Do with Our Brain? For her, the answer should be, at least in part, quote, not to replicate the caricature of the world. In her penetrating analysis of recent neuroscience discourse, Malabou draws the uncanny parallel between the image of the brain set forth in neuroscience and that suggested by neoliberalism. Both the brain and contemporary capitalist formations are described as having decentralized decision-making centers and networks that form, decompose, and reform around specific tasks. Malabou insists on seeing capital as generating and regenerating a particular caricature of the world, a portrait of ideological reductions and efficiencies that re-legitimize capital's workings. She takes plasticity as, quote, the work proper to the brain that engages with history and individual experience. What we have called the constitutive historicity of the brain is really nothing other than its plasticity, the plasticity of the central nervous system, nervous plasticity, neuronal plasticity, synaptic plasticity. We run into this word in every neurological department, in every medical school, and every hospital, in the name of every neuroscientific team. In fact, she goes on, plasticity is the dominant concept in the neurosciences. And yet, in our own everyday worlds and in our senses of who and what we are, she says, quote, our brain is plastic and we don't know it. I want us to consider how these notions of transgression and performance and plasticity brought into the sphere of theory might help us recognize that. Importantly, Malabou adds the idea of explosivity to the idea of plasticity, and that's where I want to take us. What matters now is to prepare us for an irrepeatable moment of transgression and invention, not unlike the singular transgressive moment of a concert performance. Let me now say just a few things about Grace Lee Boggs, who is the other author that I mentioned in my blog. Grace Lee Boggs, this June will turn 100 years old. I had the great honor of being on a panel with her 4 years ago when we talked about, among other things, neuroscience. She was born of a poor Chinese family in Rhode Island. She received a PhD in philosophy from Bard. Facing significant barriers in the academic world in the 1940s, she took a job at low wages at the University of Chicago Philosophy Library. As a result of their activism on tenants' rights, which will be important later in my presentation, she joined the US Workers' Party. At this point, she began a trajectory that would follow for the rest of her life, a focus on struggles of the African American community. She met C.L.R. James and moved to New York to collaborate with him. She met many important activists, including Richard Wright. She also translated into English many of the essays in the economic and philosophical manuscripts for the first time. She worked with both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, and now she works with Angela Davis. She married African-American auto worker and political activist James Boggs in 1953, and has basically been centered in Detroit, trying to regenerate that horribly destroyed city. In her last book, published 4 years ago, The Next American Revolutionary, Boggs asks, where will we get the imagination, the courage, the determination to reconceptualize the meaning and purpose of work, which he capitalizes, in a society that is becoming increasingly jobless. This demands that we not only ask, what should we do with our bodies, but also, like Malibu, Boggs asks us to think, what should we do with our brain? Plasticity here means working in and on the world. Part of her answer involves precisely art. Quote, art can help us envision the new cultural images we need to grow our souls. As the labor movement was developing in the pre-World War II years, Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath transformed the way Americans viewed themselves in relationship to faceless bankers and heartless landowners. In the 1970s and 80s, artist Judy Chicago's exhibits, The Dinner Party and The Birth Project, reimagined the vagina, transforming it from a private space and site of oppression into a public space of beauty and spiritual, as well as physical creation and liberation. In this period, we need artists to create new images that will liberate us from our preoccupation with constantly expanding production and consumption, and open up our hearts and minds to imagine and create another America that will be viewed by the world that will be viewed by the world as a beacon rather than as a danger, end quote. Critically, Boggs attaches such boundary crossings and poetic reimaginings to the issue of power. Quote, the movement promoted a consciousness that finds joy in crossing boundaries in naturalistic instead of supernatural ways and strives for empowerment rather than power and control. So here's the story behind this image. It centers on one of the most dramatic eviction cases in the United States history. During the 1960s, San Francisco, like a lot of other cities on the West Coast, was being reconstructed for the surface economy. And so a lot of real estate had to be glommed on to create these new financial centers. And a lot of it was inhabited by poor people. And there were debates, and you can actually find this quote in the minutes of the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco. One supervisor says, quote, this land is too valuable to have poor people living on it. So that began what was called beautification, which meant basically eradicating poor neighborhoods. And one of the places that they glommed onto was the International Hotel that's right next to the Transamerica Center in San Francisco. And it was a residential hotel that was inhabited largely by elderly Filipino men who had come over to work as longshoremen, but also to work with Cesar Chavez, and they were part of the formative United Farm Workers movement. Well, the hotel was bought by a transnational corporation, and a group of activists, including faculty and students from UC Berkeley, San Francisco State, joined with a group of organizers to fight the eviction. And they fought the eviction not just for 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 weeks or months. They actually fought the eviction for nearly a decade. And it got to the point that the sheriff of San Francisco refused to carry out the eviction order. But he did eventually, and it was torn down, and all you saw there for many, many years was a gaping hole in the ground and a ton of bricks. And then this really imaginative and Filipino artist literally carted out a ton of bricks. And he brought them in and he began to make these installations and do other things with them. And he said, well, you know, I'd like to take some of these bricks and grind them down and create ink and paint and do other things with them. And he asked the organizers, is that okay? And they said no. They probably said hell no. But they said that was the last memory they had of the iHotel. So he said he still thought the idea was interesting, and he looked around and he saw all this dust, all this brick dust. He said, well, I can have that. And they said, sure. So he began to fabricate objects, plastic objects, with epoxy resin. And one of the objects he fabricated, you can't see it in the image, but it's on the table, it's a fedora, which a lot of the Manongs wore. And you can't see it again, but there's a feather there, which is another one of the things they like to sort of put on to make their hats look really fun. And he also began to fabricate feathers. And he didn't fabricate just 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. He fabricated 2,005 feathers, because in 2005, the iHotel was rebuilt, and that's another story. The story I want to tell you is that he created a carpet of the feathers, which you see there in front of the fedora. And so at the private party before the opening, we were all sitting around swilling champagne and celebrating. And then the door opened to the public, and people started to wander in. And of course, they wanted to look at the hat. and they started stepping on the feathers. And they were crunching the feathers and pulverizing them. And I looked to Jerome Reyes, expecting him to be horrified. And he had this huge smile on his face. I said, Jerome, what are they doing to your artwork? He said, no, just watch. So they looked at this fedora, and then they started to walk out into the other galleries. And he shone a spotlight to the floor. And what you saw on the floor was the footprints of all the pulverized feathers. And he said, this is art. The people have come in and they've sort of absorbed this knowledge, and now they're taking it, and they're being part of this whole diasporic process, but in a very different vector. So, and then it was all erased, and the feathers were swept away, and that was it. So that's why I wanted to get back to this idea of a singular performance, this transgressive, eruptive, very pedagogical, but no particular forward anticipation of what the result will be. So I'll just end you with this. These are the questions I want us to ponder. I think this links up to what Said, Malibu, Boggs, and Reyes were all thinking about. Could there ever be anything like an activist theory or a theory of activism that could learn from these artistic practices, such as the one I just described? It'd be filled with contingent, temporary, strategic, singular, performance-driven, eruptive, collective action. We might even debate whether this could even be called theory, and if it's not able to be called theory, what's the problem with that? Thank you.
But just to say, the Library of Babel, as imagined by Borges, has been created by a computer coder, and you can visit it and search it. So this will be in the background. Let's make sure I have the, okay. I would like to meditate here on one moment in the historical and philosophical status of poetic language within critical theory, and to do so while keeping in mind the powerful technological contemporaneity of the digital age. By powerful contemporaneity, I designate the force of technological innovations to delimit everyday becoming. Technology, especially in commodity form, emanates a simple, ubiquitous, inescapable efficacy to make the present present or present in the mode of ceaseless updates. Digital technologies seem merely to facilitate contemporaneity even as they create it. Against this backdrop, my remarks will raise the question of innovation within the field of language, both poetic and technological forms. To think this question, we must remember a time when innovation in the field of language meant poetry above all, even as we remain aware that the streamlining of computational languages occupies the privileged position of linguistic innovation today. Technological instantiations of language now appear primary, not derivative. Yet our conception of the workings of technological language are not understood so much as felt, lived, navigated, and experienced. For this reason, I would argue, even as the differences between poetic and technological theories of language intensify, we might say they are simultaneously erased, made harder to see. Critiques of language's collaboration with what mid-century critical theory termed instrumentalization, operationalism, rationalization have waned in recent years. These vectors in today's terms are positively rendered: searchability, mappability, compatibility. Note how the suffix ability here encrypts or insists the seemingly foreclosed telos of progress, relocating this goal from a temporal horizon to a homuncular captive potenza. What happens when literature incorporates this ability? Poetry, having once been comfortable with the idea that its art brushed up against the immortal origins of language, endures a rude awakening. Outmoded operating system, lo-fi tropes, it's old school. Is there an innovatability for this art form? Any scamorph to rebrand this aesthetic fossil? Stéphane Mallarmé has been an important periodizing figure for critical and literary theory, by which I mean that claims about the modernity of literature frequently position Mallarmé as paradigmatic threshold for modern poetic language. For Roland Barthes, Mallarmé heralds the rise of post-realist écriture blanche, with its aesthetics of literature's necessary falling silent. Alain Badiou sees in Mallarmé's figures of crumbling mastery within a planetary void, a modern predicament of reconceiving relations between poem and matheme. Defining the modernity of literature through its emancipation from classical forms, Jacques Rancière makes Mallarmé one pivotal figure in language's overdetermination in literary modernity, between the indifferent chatter of free signification and a semiology of purified equivalences. Michel Foucault's The Order of Things similarly positions Mallarmé within modernity's epistemological break. In the philosophical space opened up by Nietzsche, Foucault's Mallarmé unveils a world where language wells up in an enigmatic multiplicity. Here we recognize the imprint of the Mallarmé with which we are now most familiar, engaged in a great task to brave the stammerings, the fragmented being of language, and endure the fragile density of the word. To the Nietzschean question, who is speaking? This is Foucault. Mallarmé replies, what is speaking is, in its fragile vibration, in its nothingness, not the meaning of the word, but its enigmatic and precarious being. Like Foucault's extinct author, Mallarmé was constantly effacing himself from his own language, an executant in a pure ceremony of the book, in which the discourse would compose itself. Through Mallarmé, Foucault announces a literary modernity in which language abandons its sovereign and transparent incarnation as well-ordered discourse to enter a shadowy and, if not infinite, then interminable realm of the absolute book. In this anonymity of the Babel archive, the extinction of the author inversely mirrors the growing volume of writing's anonymous murmur, the sound of discourse composing itself. Half polemic prophecy, half thought experiment, Foucault's utopia of language is today altered beyond recognition, not for its being obsolescent, but for its having been thoroughly achieved. It merits stressing that we live in the age of the infinite book banalized. Its writing does not only work on us, express us, record us, the writing is also working on itself. As content and as calculation, the writing has two faces. The technological realization of Mallarmé's absolute book and Foucault's authorless discourse hardly lacks isomorphism with cloud computing and a host of other examples. For Mallarmé, and perhaps even for Foucault, language's absolute potential, we might say its achievability, gave a glimpse of the beyond. Yet we now live every day of our lives in precisely this ecosystem, this highly knowable totality. Mallarmé redefines the book as the total expansion of the letter. Insisting that the book be impersonified, he presciently formulates writing's non-human agency. Among human accessories, the book takes place all by itself. Its buried meaning moves and arranges into a chorus, the pages. Between Mallarmé and corpus linguistics computers, learning readings through stochastic algorithms lies 1 century of days. Yet such innovations in language have not, in another sense, been awaiting fulfillment. The dream unchanged was already at work in the modern concept of language. If Mallarmé speaks of the miracle of language's infinity, he also faults it for its plurality. His ambition is for a melodic encipherment, to engineer linguistic cognition, these are his words, using verbal keyboards and literary mechanisms, keyboard is instrument, but close, that will be better than dreaming. The apparatus is equal to it, chides Mallarmé, addressing one skeptical pre-digital reader. Don't judge these words as too industrial or having too much to do with materiality. Mallarmé already inhabits the horizon where writing turns from its authors to work on itself. Foucault's vision of literary modernity insists there appear, like so many projects or chimeras, who can tell as yet, the themes of a universal formalization of all discourse, an internal exegesis of the world which would at the same time be its total demystification, a transformation without residuum of all forms of discourse into a single word, all books into a single page, the whole world into one book. In his early essay, Language to Infinity, Foucault notes, the space of language today is not defined by rhetoric, but by the library. By the ranging to infinity of fragmentary languages, language left to its own devices, fated to be infinite because it can no longer support itself upon the speech of infinity. Referring to classical age strategies for impeding this linguistic hypertrophy, he demurs, rhetoric is a means of momentarily postponing the burning of libraries. What would it mean to understand our own literary moment situated within this everyday infinity of language? What literary operations will emerge from the capture of this achieved totality, from the deep within an already encompassing system of inscription terawatts more powerful than any classical age schematophilia? Foucault's literary modernity seeks a shelf for the impossible book that tells of all books, where in their totality they are captured and subsumed. Literary modernity then seems its own fire in the archive. But where are we when the library can no longer be burned? While innovations in poetic language have always attended to conventions for expressing productive transgression, they must also now negotiate the active presencing, self-presencing, and murmuring of an in no way auxiliary non-human system, whose present tense totality renews at every moment, signification fully operative within good enough infinity, for which literature undoubtedly no longer claims to be the apotheosis. In this humbling of literature, human language at last becomes minor. But what will we make of our minority amidst this immensity of signification? Mallarmé speaks of a fold of dark lace which holds the infinite, woven by thousands, each according to his own thread or extension, not knowing the secret that assembles distant spacing in which riches yet to be inventoried sleep.
I apologize for requiring the lights to be on. At a certain moment, strategically, I'll launch into this PowerPoint, and the lights will go down, and my voice will dim as well. I'd like to begin, as one does, with a consideration of our question. My goal is to point to an asymmetry that's in it, not to make a kind of grammar Nazi observation about how this might work, but rather because it seems to me a stubborn and persistent and symptomatically interesting asymmetry in the conceptualization of the relation between critical theory and art, broadly speaking, that is not reducible. It's not something that we can get rid of in any particular way, and which I think allows us to think about what will be the subject of my remarks briefly today, that is abstraction. The history of abstraction and how we inhabit a different modality of abstraction today than we might have inhabited, say, at the time that Marx is writing is what is of interest to me. So, over the past 40 years, I'm going to take that extensively and say 43. Over the past 43 years, many performing artists, visual artists, and writers claim to have learned from reading critical theory and engaging with its concepts. During this time period, what, if anything, have critical theorists learned from the arts? How might renewed or intensified scrutiny of artistic practices constructively inflect emerging and future iterations of critical theory? The stubborn asymmetry that I want to point out here is one that you've no doubt remarked between the learning from concepts that artists can do with respect to the object that we call critical theory. An artist learns from the concepts of critical theory, and on the other side, what we critical theorists, at least I, critical theorists, might do, which is to scrutinize this other object thing, which is the artistic item here. Now, this is a rather old, I want to suggest, asymmetry, and it speaks to the disciplinary difference between critical theory and the performing arts, the visual arts, other forms of art. The device that I'm going to use, as you have gathered from my brief intro, to make this distinction is the notion of abstraction. Concepts are abstractions of the particular versions of objects that artists can perform. What artists do can be abstracted into concepts, but those concepts are not, as it were, in the possession of the artists, and the artists need to look to critical theory to acquire the concepts of what they are producing as artistic objects. On the other side, the critical theorist looks to the artist for that thing from which he or she derives the concepts, from which he or she can abstract some item and then produce a kind of generality of some sort. This is very nice, it's very old, but the notion of abstraction, decades, as Gayatri was saying last night, it's decades, at least decades old, this conception here. I want to propose that we might think that what critical theory has learned from, should always be learning from the arts, is what the arts should also be learning from critical theory. That is, that this is a misconception of the notion of concept, and a misconception of the notion of scrutiny, and a misconception of the notion of performance. And this is not a misconception that we can eradicate. It's constitutive of the notion of concept, of the notion of performance, of the notion of reading, of the notion of scrutiny. We live in a historicized version of this asymmetrical set of aporias, organized for us now around a differential system surrounding the concept of abstraction. So I'm going to give you 4 notions of abstraction, ending with the one that I find most curious, which I call green screen abstraction. Right? So the first one is the conventional one. Well, it's not exactly conventional, but let's call it conventional. Real abstraction. This comes to us through the Marxian terminology. It has to do with the generation of index values. It has to do, in this specific case, with absorbing the fact that the work of art, as it were, is perfectly useless and thus has only exchange value, and in the current commodities market is thus an instance of something that is perfectly and always already tradable and only tradable without any species of use attached to it as well, except as a tradable item, accruing value according to contingent and determinate modalities across markets. This is old, this is cool. 2 alternative forms of abstraction, because this is a form of abstraction, that is the kind of value that an artistic commodity might have across markets, is indeed a kind of abstract value, and the less the use of it, the more abstract the value is. 2 alternatives to this fairly established form of value assessment and of abstraction emerge in the mid to late 60s as concerns precisely the abstraction of art, or the abstractability of visual art. And I'll read you, these are in increasing order of bizarreness, so that the sort of green screen abstraction or green screen theory is the most bizarre. And I'll simply end with an image from that. The first one I'm going to give you is from Althusser. And I'll simply remind you of the great essay that he devoted to Cremonini. The Cremonini essay is an adaptation of the Marxian value theory, and it hypothesizes that in place of the dynamics of real subsumption and of real abstraction that you get in classic Marxian aesthetics, we should instead talk about abstraction as a form of the production of not the representation of realistic relations among humans, but of the actual relations of domination and of economic relations. Abstraction then is what you might say relational abstraction, or the representation of relation. And because relation is itself an abstract concept, a relational abstraction is the representation of an abstraction, and it also has the effect of producing the insight that there is relation in the person viewing it. So the Marxian kind of real abstraction, followed by what we call the Althusserian relational abstraction. The next one is, and I will read this out loud, you will recognize it exactly where it comes from, I'm sure. It begins with a citation from Hoffmann's little essay, the little novella, the Prinzessin Brambilla, the moment in which man falls is the first in which his real eye stands straight This is my quick translation, and the author continues, Hoffmann has his mythical king initiated into the mysteries of irony proclaim, and lest we imagine that this is the assertion of a positive, hopeful future for prince and country, he immediately drops dead on the spot. Similarly, in the last paragraph of the text, when the prince pompously proclaims that the magical source of irony has given humanity eternal happiness in his ascent to self-knowledge, Hoffmann pursues, here the text disappears, it dies. The story breaks off with the evocation of the painter Callot, whose marvelous images we've just been seeing, and the story, whose drawings have indeed been the source of the story. These drawings represent figures from the Commedia dell'arte floating against a background that is precisely not the world adrift in an empty sky. That's Paul de Man giving you a version of abstraction as the emptiness of the sky, as the empty sky. It's the place where the claims of realism, the claims of reference, bump up against a notion of abstraction and of emptiness, which produces the irony that is typically Schlegelian. From this point on, he will go and introduce the notion of irony as a permanent interruption or parabasis that we know so well. And these are the Callot images here in their extended form. It's not exactly clear to me, as you'll see, that these are images occurring against an empty sky. That seems to me a bit of a stretch on de Man's part, but not perhaps impermissible. The last version of abstraction, I think, is the one that came before you, what I was calling green screen abstraction, which came before you in my images of the water bottle from the HSBC advertising campaign. This is a strong effort to switch the Gestalt procedure of background, empty abstraction, foreground, actual figure, and present the background, the green screen, as of this advertising procedure as the bearer of the value of the advertising campaign, but also as the bearer of the value of the culture around it. It's not empty, it's not neutral, and it does not take the shape of this real abstraction. This green screen abstraction, which is the form of abstraction of current commodity capitalism, is also the form of abstraction on which current contemporary art and critical theory are going to depend from now on. Now, I've made it sound as though this four-way system surrounding the concept of abstraction is actually a kind of sequence going from Marx to green screen abstraction. This is clearly not the case. What is at issue for us now, and this is what the relation between critical theory and art consists in right now, is the negotiation of this coexisting four-part system of abstraction procedures that include the Marxian, the Althusserrian, the Domanian, if you want, and the green screen abstraction form, and which from this point on this is a kind of Domanian idiom, it will be the task of critical theory from this point on to negotiate this four-part abstraction. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'll be brief. I want to thank Georges and Julia and others for inviting me to participate in this very interesting panel and this wonderful crowd on a very, very lovely Saturday afternoon. I want to do my very best at this moment to sublimate the questions we've been asked to answer so that they are only implicit in what I'm about to say. I wouldn't presume to try and directly answer them. But I do want to begin with two gambits. I want to remind you that Adorno's great aesthetic theory begins. Today it goes without saying that nothing concerning art goes without saying, much less without thinking. It seems to me that those are words we're all pondering at this very moment today. The other gambit, it wouldn't be appropriate to have a session like this in which somebody didn't quote themselves. So I'm going to quote myself. This is from my essay in this little book on Stiegler. The title of my essay is Techno-Pharmacogenealogy. You see how Derrida pervades everything. And I begin my little essay by saying, when Bernard Stiegler asserts at the opening of Technics and Time 1 that, quote, at its very origin and up until now, philosophy has repressed technics as an object of thought. Technics is the unthought. He is making both the immediate point that from Plato onwards, technics has been the dangerous other, that only with Nietzsche, Freud, and their descendants has technics emerged from the shadows, and the subtler but more significant point that technics is both hyper-anthropological and extra-phenomenological. Enough of me. So I continue with the immortal words of Nietzsche, we have art lest we perish of the truth. What does he mean in terms of our relationship to critical theory? I want to suggest, and since he's dead, he can't walk in a la Woody Allen and say, you know nothing of my work. I will say that what he means when he says we have art lest we perish of the truth is that the truth for Nietzsche is, I must create meaning, and that in order to live, I must accept that I am going to die. And art helps us push back against the truth by working through what Nietzsche knew all too well and what Stiegler knows all too well, has to do with art as techne. Techne, that is to say, back to the origins, the etymological origins of the notion of truth in the Greek techne, which actually, of course, literally means skill. That is to say, the purposive manipulation of materials. So the truth, in Nietzsche's sense, in my sense, I would suggest in the sense of critical theory when it's analyzing art, is not the correspondence between reality and representation, but the critical evaluation of reality, not conformity to, but resistance against any given. That is to say, the refusal of integration. Art, that is to say, considered critically, is unnatural. Nothing natural is art. For critical theory, looking at this notion of truth and art, I want to suggest that we must place ourselves in the position not just of vision, that is to say, the position of the artist and the viewer, experiencer of art, but in the position of urvision or revision, the analytical perspective. This is what Bourdieu calls symbolic legitimization. That is to say, participation, by definition, in the art world, which consists of institutions. Adorno tells us that art's double character, Derrida's double bind if you like, both autonomous and instrumentalized, is the defining element in a given politico-social structure. For Adorno, this means requisite participation in the culture industries. There is, he says, no escaping it. It's a question of what we do with it. Can art, can critical theory, relative to art, as it were, free itself from this double bind, or must it reconcile itself to and live within and operate within that bifurcation? And if so, what are the implications of that? There have been some attempts at liberation, such things as Happenings, Alan Capro's work, Eleanor Anton's work, the Situationist International, with which we're all familiar, the work of Guy Debord in the films that he made, for example. We are immersed, they all tell us, in the capitalist art system, and this is our art world at this very moment. The relationship for art between value and meaning is where you and I are at this crossroads of art and critical theory. Given that, as the anthropologists and the cultural anthropologists tell us, value has to do strictly with the present state of things. The present state of things. That itself is very problematic, obviously. Whereas meaning is the accumulation of present states through memory. Art is then the claim to value without meaning. One might say, au sens. Theory requires the return of meaning-making, the perpetual, eternal return of meaning-making. The relationship between the two, then, is the question. This is what critical theory interrogates in its very essence. Modern art can be defined as the effort to emancipate art process from ideologies and formal political social structures. And I show you pictures of hands on the wall, which, as you've seen already, is the image on the front of Sieler's book on, the book on Stiegler and techniques. Because, of course, this is the first work of critical theory. That is to say, the artist's choice to sign her work. We now know that most of these hand images were made by women. To sign her work in a kind of negative theology. That is to say, I'm here, my hand is not. So that the signature, the sign of the artist, left behind in its multiplicity on the cave walls, is obviously the way in which the whole notion of revision begins to happen. And we've heard about, from David, we've heard about the way in which the dust of bricks actually works. Click, please. From Avery, we've heard about the way in which the Mallarméan text works. By the way, my Nietzsche book contains my effort at the translation of Un coup de dé in its appendix. But when we look at the cave walls, what we actually see is not only the notion of the way in which art works, but the way in which critical theory works as well. It's very interesting that if you see this in Jansen or in any of the art theory and art history books, what you'll see in the caption for this image is Chinese horse. Well, obviously, it's not a Chinese horse in the cave at Lascaux in the south of France. There were just very few concepts of the Han Dynasty or the Ming Dynasty, et cetera, et cetera. This is a Chinese horse because of the convention of recent, that is to say the last few centuries of Chinese art, and the way in which this fulsome image of the absolutely gorgeously aesthetically produced horse reminds us, gives us a sense of the meaning of horseness with regard to the way in which the artist produced the image. I wanted you to notice, by the way in which the brick dust was spat on the wall of the cave at Lascaux here, both the black and the red. And by the way, I can't ever show this image without pointing out to you the way in which not only is the three-dimensionality of this image caught by the fact that it's produced in a particular place on the cave wall where the stone bows out, and therefore the body of the horse is actually a three-dimensional body. But in addition to that, the three-dimensionality is picked up on by the fact, as you'll notice, that the image itself has a third dimension. The back legs are separated from the body of the horse by space. I don't know about you, but if somebody said to me, I'll give you $1 million if you can draw a horse as well as this, I'd lose the bet. It's really remarkable as a statement of the way in which the image crosses over to the notion of the critical value, that is to say, the meaning-making of the image itself. So, art is the claim to value without meaning. This is what Rancière means by what he calls the shift from a representation regime to an aesthetic one, what Deleuze means by the shift from representation to sensation. Now, thus art is, according to both Rancière and Deleuze and others, we'll talk more about it in a moment, this means that art is existentially empty. It is not about the world, but about itself. Appearance as world. For art, objects are meaningful in and for themselves. Their essence is non-referential. This is art's power and its disruption. Now, this is the case that's made by Benjamin, by Adorno, by Rancière, by Deleuze, and by many other critical theorists. But if art has no power other than the considerable power of its appearance, any attempt to instill it with meaning must at some point fail. And critical theory, insofar as it relates to this view of art, predicates itself precisely on this failure. But what is such a resistance to do if culture, our contemporary techno-culture, our hyper-mediated culture, no longer pushes back against this resistance? If culture is satisfied with a dispersed and fragmented biopower, where are we then? What is the role of critical theory in such a world? If critical theory is always a return, a revision of thought onto itself, it is, of course, reflective. And the danger is always the fetishization of critique itself as the object of its own critique. When critical theory turns its attention, and that's what it consists of, attention, to art, it focuses on that which is not subject to thought, but only to afterthought. Relative to all art is the concept of Werketreue, being true to the work of art. But when we play with a work of art, playing a piece of music, playing with an interpretation of a painting or a sculpture, etc., we must, if we are critical theorists, resist it. And we must resist our critical position. We must expose ourselves to the hegemony of conceptual thought and its attempts to overcome the work of art. Because the work of art is, in its essence, resistance to the concept by which it can be articulated or defined. Critical theory is always about capturing what is always chimerical, always a to come, an avenir. It is a realization that is always missed and missing. That is to say, art is an incursion into the realm of thought of that which does not belong to the realm of thought. But art cannot be fully subversive. The degree to which it claims to subvert normatives is the degree to which it engages in a dialogue with it. This is Stigler's reaction to adaptation and adoption. Artist's work is to sustain the critical moment of aesthetic experience. That of the critical theorist is to recognize and pay attention to this sustenance. That is, the job of both art and critical theory is the provoking of recognition. The task of critical theory is to register the non-conceptual while attempting to bring it into the realm of concepts. If artworks are, and are failing to be, forms of consciousness, or consciousness rendered formal, then consciousness consists of the potential for its own conditions of possibility. If critical theory is awareness and articulation of the social context of and for artistic production, on the relations of power within which artworks function, it is also, after Lyotard, Lyotard, and others, a critique of all claims to authenticity. Since the 1970s, art and critical theory have grown closer through conceptual art, performance art, installation, much of which is language-based and conceptual. If language is the medium in which thought occurs, then paint, or any other non-linguistic medium, masks the word. But is this adequate? Is this interesting? Is this provocative? Can significance and signification be structured in other ways? That is to say, what is the relationship between signification and meaning? Well, as a closing remark, I'll say that we're learning a tremendous amount about this in contemporary neuroscience. Studies of semiosis, of neuroscience and the functioning of the brain, as we see with Katalin and others, indicate that the word does not necessarily underlie human thought. Big surprise. Visual imagery is central to cognition in and of itself. A direct translation of rods and cones into visual imagery in various minute parts. Concepts are created non-verbally, then mapped out onto linguistic forms. Words and images are epiphenomena of mental processes. So, critical theory must look beyond the seeming incoherence and strangeness of the pictorial down, as it were, to its marks to find what's next. Thank you.